the cookie jar.
War Communism. Okie dokie, let's have a little chat through that. So, by mid 1918, state capitalism was no longer sustainable. The Civil War was beginning to unfold, and one of the classic slogans from the Civil War era is Trotsky's everything for the front. And that's a really great encapsulation or summary about what war communism was trying to achieve. It was gearing the economy to the war effort. At the same time, there was ideological things going on. So this was a little bit more of a, not a little bit more, a substantial shift towards a more communist socialist way of organising the economy.
Stop. Move away from the cookie jar.
Yeah, he's going to fall over. No, we're back. Cool. Yeah, so where are I going with that one? A jump into socialism, a leap into communism is how some historians have described it. Another way to think about it is Alec Nove described it well, I think, as a siege economy with a communist ideology. The way that I kind of articulated that was this is communism in response to war. So in mid-1918, a series of centralised, more militarised policies are implemented. It's not till after 1921, when what's called the NEP comes about, that they look back and go, what will we be doing? And they come up with that term war communism, that what was happening was forced upon us by the war, according to Lenin, by the war emergency. So war communism is a series of policies and principles. Let's unpack that in a bit more depth. So let's get this picture up. Okay, make me go smaller. I want this one. Why is this not working? Okay, now we're looking a little bit better. Okay, so what are we going to do here? The features, the key policies of war communism. So first one that we'll highlight is the nationalisation of industry. So war communism witnessed a greater degree of control by Sovnarkom Vysenka, the Supreme Council of the National Economy of Industry. More and more industrial enterprises were taken over by the state, to the point where virtually every economic activity was state run. That's the first thing. Next, war communism witnessed the militarization of the workplace. So workplace conditions became far more stricter. The type of work became very directed by authorities. If the workplace conditions were managed in the way that military discipline might be. Trotsky said that a deserter from the front is as despicable as a deserter from the front. Little elements to that too. Perhaps that was experienced by everyday people would be the Subotniki, where that was initially a voluntary initiative but soon became a compulsory one, that you were compelled to work on your weekends doing kind of crappy jobs like unloading the railway, sweeping the roads clean of snow, etc. Another elements to this too were forced work gangs of the bourgeoisie. So former people of bourgeois background were forced to do harsh work. Labour armies, that's be the high point, you might say, of war communism, where Trotsky proposed that demobilised soldiers be used in the industry, who would be subject to the same discipline as they were in the army that they would be in the workplace. And overall, war communism sees far harsher workplace conditions too, where workers could be subject to fines, the removal of their ration card, that would be one of the most feared ones, and far longer and more difficult working conditions. That sucked, okay, but there were some elements that might be considered positive. There was a range of state-supplied services that became free public transport, public housing was made available by the seizure of large houses and apartments of the rich and distributing those to the poor. A ration system, so we'll be a little bit loose with this. Food became free to some extent. The state provided canteens, but the food quality was appalling and not enough. And a rationing system was introduced where, based on the amount of food that you were allocated, correlated to your social background. Those who got the most were members of the party, the military, workers of heavy industry. The bourgeoisie got the least. As Zinoviev said, they'd get just enough bread to remember the smell of it. That another element to war communism that relates to this is the elimination of a monetary economy. The communists purposefully induced hyperinflation, printed more money until money became absolutely worthless. This meant that people were more and more reliant upon the state, but were also forced to, ironically, stepping away from that cookie jar, were having to engage in black market trading, so barter. So you got this ironic situation where, in an attempt to eliminate capitalism, more people than ever before are engaged in private trading. And there was a phenomenon called bagmen, of people who would take goods and trade them, particularly like might travel to the countryside and find some grain and bring it back and trade that with for tools with workers. If you were be sitting in a Central Committee meeting in 1919, one of the critical issues that would be raised again and again was the issue of bread. And therefore, securing bread, Lenin called it the crusade for bread. Enough food for the cities and for the soldiers was critical. The communist authorities experimented with a range of different ways of dealing with this. The first one they went for was the Commie, or committees of the poor. Why this worked was that poor peasants were encouraged to form committees of the poor, committee, and they were encouraged to take the grain of their rich neighbours. And the bonus was they get to keep some, the rest they had to return to the state. This failed as a policy. For the most part, many peasants all identified as poor. They were meant to attack a group target a group called the kulaks, rich peasants. But determining exactly who that was difficult. So Lenin was obsessed that the kulaks hoarding grain must be responsible for the grain crisis. But many in the countryside didn't feel this way and felt that being pressured by outside authorities was instead the problem of what was happening, and therefore united instead against external authorities. That led then the communists to try a little bit more force, and Prodrovertska, forced grain requisitioning squads were formed. These were armed workers, Chekists, and Red Army soldiers who were sent to the countryside to take as much grain as possible, and they took any grain they could find, believing it was a hoarded surplus when in fact it wasn't. They even took seed grain. That's the grain that you'd be keeping over to plant for the next season. And overall, then, that led to a dramatic downturn in agricultural production. And while we'll get rid of that because we've done all our little elements now. And while then war communism was celebrated by many in the party, there's talk of how wonderful that the elimination of money is revealed to be just what it really is, coloured paper, and there's great sense of jubilation at the end of bourgeois privilege. What this meant, though, for most people in the cities was a life of terrible suffering and great difficulty. In my next little YOLO chat, we'll talk about the impacts of the Civil War. Won't that be fun? Till next time, that's Vidania.